Hey math students, welcome to my kitchen, and this is where we are going to hold today's math lesson, because today's math lesson is all about cooking, which you guys know that I love to cook and I love to eat even more. So today I'm going to share with you my family's famous banana bread recipe, and this is the best banana bread in the world. So, couple ground rules. If you are going to make my family's famous banana bread recipe, make sure you have the permission and help of an adult in your house, because I am going to be using the oven today, so please do not try this at home without the supervision of an adult. And we are going to apply some math. So we're going to be working with some fractions today. The fraction we're going to be working with is a benchmark fraction, 1/4. I have my 1/4 cup measuring cup. And if you're going to choose to do your own family recipe and share it with me, I would love to see it and to hear from you. So if you are doing that, make sure you also have your family or an adult's permission from your household. So let's get started with our banana bread recipe today. So if you want to make the best banana bread ever, here is the recipe that I'm going to be using for my banana bread today. In fact, it even says the best banana bread ever eaten. And I promise you guys, it is so good. Let's talk about the ingredients you're going to need. So you're going to need some sugar, just regular sugar is fine. You're going to need a little bit of flour. And so the flour that you use, I'm using all-purpose. You could use any kind of flour, whether it's self-rising, bread flour. You're going to need bananas for your banana bread. Now, the more ripe the bananas, the better. So if your bananas look like this, obviously you're not going to want to eat these bananas. So they're perfect bananas for banana bread. So don't throw them out. You'll want to use them. You'll need about 2 or 3 bananas depending on the size. You're going to need milk. Now the recipe calls for buttermilk, but I'm just going to use regular milk because that's what I have. You're going to need vegetable oil. And you're going to need, I'm using pan. You can use butter, you can use more vegetable oil, but you're going to need something for the bottom of your pan. So I'm going to use 2 bread pans that look like this. You can use whatever pans you have. Sometimes I put them in just like a brownie pan or a cake pan as well. So here's the recipe. Again, if you want to know how much of each ingredient you need, just pause the video here. Now, before we get started today, let's talk dividing fractions. So the first type of fraction we can divide is we can take a whole number and divide it by a fraction. So that's as simple as the problem 3 divided by 1/3. So when I see the problem 3 divided by 1/3, I'm basically asking myself, I want to divide 3 wholes into thirds. So I want to know how many, and this is what I'm going to write down, how many 1/3 or how many thirds are in 3 wholes. So I can simply draw a visual model out. So I can draw 3 wholes. There's 1 hole, there's 2 holes, and there's 3 holes. And I'm wanting to know how many thirds are in 3 holes. So I need to take each of my holes and divide it into thirds. So there's a third, there's a third, there's a third. And then I need to divide this hole into thirds. So I'm taking all 3 holes and dividing it into thirds. And of course, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I have 9 thirds. So 3 divided by 1/3 is equal to 9. So there's my answer. That's how many thirds are in 3 holes. There are 9 thirds in 3 holes. And of course, there's a second type of dividing fractions. The second type of dividing fractions is basically a fraction divided by, so a fraction divided by a whole. So if I take a fraction and I divide a fraction by a whole, now let's kind of switch this around. Let's say I want to do 1/3 divided by 3. So 1/3 divided by 3. So what I need to do is I need to say, okay, let's go back to my whole model. So here's my whole, right? And I'm kind of going to use something that looks similar to our area model for multiplication that we've used. So I want to show basically a third. So I want to take this whole and I divide it into thirds. So here's my 1/3, and I'm going to basically shade in 1/3 of my fraction bar. So I've shaded in a third. Now I'm dividing by 3. So I'm basically saying, okay, I want to take and I want to divide this third into 3 equal parts. So now I'm going to cut them this way into 3 equal parts, and I'm going to shade in one of those 3 equal parts. So I'm going to shade it in the opposite way like this. So there's 1, 2, 3 equal parts. Now, what do I have shaded in? So I have this section that's shaded in for both. So what is this section of my whole? Well, there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 of those equal parts. I have one of them shaded in. So that would be 1/9. Okay, so 1/3 divided by 3 equals 1/9 of a fraction. So 1/3 divided by 3 is the same as 1/3 times 1/3 times, or I'm sorry, 1/3 times 1/3, which is equal to 1/9. So that's another way I can look at this. So that's how I kind of divide my fractions. And we'll look at the algorithm, the standard algorithm on dividing a whole number by a fraction in a little bit here as we get going on our math problem. Now, why are we talking about dividing fractions? Because we are going to cook and make our banana bread using only our 1/4 measuring cup. So to do that, we're going to have to divide fractions. So I created all of our ingredients for our banana bread here. So I've listed all of our ingredients, and I've listed how much of each ingredient we need. And the question we want to ask is, how many fourths, because I'm using a 1/4 measuring cup, how many fourths are in whatever amount of ingredients I need? So I need 1 3/4 cups of flour. So I want to know how many fourths are in 1 3/4 cups. So this is a division problem. This is 1 3/4 divided by 1/4. So you're saying how many 1/4 are in 1 3/4 cups? So to do this, I simply need to think about, okay, 1 3/4. Well, I can turn that into an improper fraction. I know that 1 whole would be 4/4, and 4/4 plus 3/4, 4 plus 3 is 7. So this is basically 7/4 divided by 1/4. And I know that 7/4 divided by 1/4 is, of course, this is the algorithm that I want to show you, by the way. So I can do this by this keep, change, flip. So I'm going to keep the 7/4. I'm going to change the division sign to multiplication. And then I'm going to flip this fraction to make it 4/1. So I know that 7 times 4 is 28. And I know that 4 times 1 is 4. So you have 28/4. Well, that's 28 divided by 4. And you know that 28 divided by 4 because 7 times 4 is 28. So this is equal to 7. So there are 7/4 in 1 3/4. So this is going to be 7/4. Okay, so we're going to do this for each one of our ingredients listed here. Another way you can look at this is using the fraction bars. So if I want to know how many fourths are in 1 1/2, I can draw out 1 1/2. So I can say, all right, I have 1 whole and I have 1/2. How many fourths are in what I have here? So I'm going to divide all of these wholes into fourths, right? So I have fourths now. How many fourths are in this? So this is 1 1/2 divided by 1/4. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 fourths in 1 1/2. So 1 1/2 divided by 1/4 equals 6. there are 6/4. So I'm going to go through the rest of my ingredients and see how many fourths are in that. So here is my ingredients list with all the fourths that I need for each ingredient. So this should make sense. If it calls for 1/4 of a cup of milk, how many fourths is 1/4? Well, that's 1/4 divided by 1/4, which is equal to 1. So I'm going to use one of these 1/4 measuring cups to measure my milk. Now, the nuts are optional in the recipe. I'm not going to put nuts in them. So let's get baking. So I have 2 bowls because I'm going to put all of my dry ingredients in one bowl and all of my wet ingredients in the other bowl. So let's start with our dry ingredients. So it calls for 1 3/4 cups of flour. So that means I'm going to use 7/4. So I'm going to measure 7/4 of my flour. And then it calls for 1 1/2 cups of sugar. So that would be 6/4. So I'm going to measure 6/4 of my sugar, and then it does call for baking soda, and I didn't go over this ingredient before because it only calls for a teaspoon of baking soda. So we're going to take a teaspoon of baking soda and add that in, and then we're going to do our flour and our sugar. I'm going to measure 7/4 cups of my flour. So here's, and you're going to want to make sure you kind of shake it a little bit in the bag to make sure it's level. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 cups of 7/4 of flour, which is equivalent to 1 3/4 cups. And then I'm going to do 6/4 of my sugar. So I'm going to knock some of that flour off. So I'm going to do 6/4. There's 1. And if a little bit spills over, that's fine. 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's my 6/4 of sugar. Now I use a fork to kind of mix this up. That way it kind of gets it all mixed together nice and evenly. So you're going to want to kind of mix those dry ingredients up to make sure that baking soda and the flour and the sugar get all mixed in. Now if you want to add the salt, that's optional. So it does call for 1/2 teaspoon of salt. I don't put the salt in just to watch my sodium intake because it's healthier that way. So we'll get all those mixed up and then we'll switch over to our wet ingredients.